Welcome to another edition of the Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. I am John Schmeelk. Today, we're joined by a friend of the program. He was with us at the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. He is Sam Bruchhaus, who is with Sumer Sports. Should I call you an analyst, Sam? What is your official title? I should have looked that up before we started.
My official title is a senior data scientist. And so basically what that means is I'm breaking down the stats, I'm doing the research, and then I'm bringing it to the people, John.
All right, so let's start here. Quarterback play. What's your favorite big stat to look at that gives you a good overarching feel for whether or not a quarterback is playing well?
So this is a really interesting one, primarily because it's very difficult to differentiate between what the quarterback is doing and what the rest of the team is doing. Of course, the quarterback does touch the ball every play. And so when we're looking at things like expected points added per play or per drop back, and what expected points added is, you often think about a player had 300 yards, but 300 yards doesn't always mean the same thing if you're always in 3rd and 15 and you're getting 12 yards and not getting the first down. So it tries to put those things in context. That's what expected points added does. And that is kind of the crown jewel of offensive efficiency metrics, EPA per play. So as a result, when we look at quarterbacks, that's typically the first metric we go and look at, EPA per drop back, where a drop back is a sack, a scramble, or an attempted pass. The problem with that is you're going to notice a lot of interesting names at the top of that. In particular, the one who has come up time and time again have been Jimmy Garoppolo back in the days when he was in San Francisco, and now Brock Purdy. And so there's a question of how much we can differentiate a player's EPA per play or EPA per drop back from his coach, from his offensive line, from his wide receivers. Nonetheless, it gives you a great description of how successful that offense has been with the quarterback at the helm.
And folks, if you haven't guessed it based off our first question of this interview, this is going to be very heavy, kind of where we are in the analytics world and what are some of the best numbers to look at in terms of this stuff. And Sam, for fans that are out there that want to find EPA per dropback, I know there is some stuff from paid services that we can get that. Is there a place with public availability information available where you can find EPA play data? And my understanding is that the EPA formula is also maybe a little bit different based on where you're looking it up, right?
Yeah, that's correct. If you want to find EPA per play, check us out at sumersports.com. You can find it for free. Up there, we have going back to 2022, I believe. We'll be updating it every single week this year alongside the NFL season. And you're exactly right, John. It does change a little bit. The core elements that it is adjusting for typically are down and distance and time left on the clock. Those are two really key ones because it provides that game state. It tells you that context of a 3rd and 15 or a gain of 12 on 3rd and 15 just doesn't mean as much as a great pass on 3rd and 5. And then, you look at other things. Some people include weather. Some people include other elements about team strength. But the core is just putting the state of the game as it stands across football, across history in the NFL with down, distance, time, and the amount that a team is down by. That's typically the 3 core elements.
That makes sense. All right, now let's go to a different quarterback metric that we talk about a lot, and I think Giant fans will be focusing on a lot this year because of Russell Wilson and what he's done over the course of his career. And that's the idea of pressure and sacks. Now, I think we've all figured out that sacks have a lot to do with the quarterback. Pressure has more to do with the offensive line than sacks do, but pressure is also a quarterback function. So I guess my question for you, if you see a quarterback is getting sacked a lot and pressured a lot, what are some of the metrics you look at to figure out, all right, how much of this is the quarterback, how much of this is the O-line, and how do you sort through all that?
So to sort through it, I want to break down first the difference between a pressure and a sack, because a sack is a result. When that player's butt hits the ground and the play stops, it is a sack. It's a completely objective observation, whereas a pressure can be defined in a multitude of different ways. Charting services may define it as when a player, quote, feels the pressure, or when a player is disrupted. That can mean a lot of things. The way we like to do it in terms of tracking data, in terms of the NGS, is when there's a high probability of a sack occurring. So there's a lot of different definitions, but as long as you're consistent in what that definition is, you kind of get the idea. So there's a little bit of a fugaziness. I don't want to call it a fugaziness, but a little bit of an unclear definition to what a pressure is, but as long as it's consistent, it's basically fine. And it typically will track directionally across definitions. And so the key thing that we really like to look at, number one, is pressure to sack rate. When a quarterback is pressured, and there is particularly early, which, like you said, is typically blamed a little bit more on the offensive line than it is on the quarterback, given the quarterback hasn't even dropped back within a second or two period. We want to know how good he is at avoiding those situations and avoiding the ground. And when it comes to a player like Russell Wilson, for example, sack rate hasn't been fantastic in his career. And that's why it's going to be something that's absolutely so key. But then you look at a player like Jackson Dart as well. He was more of a scrambler in college. He probably is going to be a little bit more mobile given his age and given the profile that he likes to, go to his first or second read and avoid the sack. And given that sacks are immensely harmful to the expected points in a draft, in a drive, it causes a lot of problems when those sacks come up. So that's the key stat that we like to look at. It's pretty sticky. It has around a 50 to 60% correlation out of 100 per year, which is one of the better statistics across position groups in the NFL. And as a result, it really gives us a sense of what the quarterback actually does to avoid those massive negative plays when he hits the ground on pass plays.
And you guys track that as well on Sumer, the pressure to sack ratio?
Yep. You can check out our pressure ratios and our sack ratios on sumersports.com.
And I guess give an idea, and we're going to have we had another interview a week ago talking about this too, but
yeah,
we know how much turnovers can hurt. Mm-hmm. And, turnover ratio is a huge, definer of who's going to win or lose games. But sacks oftentimes, while not as bad as turnovers, right, they really do make it difficult to score points if you're getting sacked a lot on a drive.
Right. And you look at turnovers and you really think about the nature of turnovers, and there is a handoff necessarily between the offense and the defense. So as a result, there has to be a lot of variables in a turnover. And because of that, they are a little harder to predict. So take, for example, a player like Josh Allen 2 years ago, where he was an MVP candidate, but the team really wasn't that good. He threw a lot of picks, but he was also pushing the ball down the field a lot. There were so many variables in that it didn't necessarily kill Josh Allen as much as it may a player who's not as talented. But then you look at a player like Bo Nix this year, who wasn't as talented, wasn't really pushing the ball down the field, and wasn't a truly efficient passer in his rookie year, but avoided sacks at an immensely good level. And that basically, because he was not losing those massive chunks of yards, allowed the offense of the Denver Broncos to kind of match the excellence of the defense, and ended up leading to them becoming a pretty good team, despite not having the most efficient passing offense of all time. And so that's why those key metrics like pressure to sack ratio, where Bo Nix is absolutely incredible, a superstar, despite not being a necessary superstar in other descriptive metrics, makes such a big difference. Because even though you may not be getting those explosive plays, you may not be spreading the ball around, you're just able to keep the chains moving because you're not getting those absolutely massive negative plays.
It reminds me of the 4 factors in the NBA, right? If you don't turn it over, you win free throws, you win offensive rebounds, you maximize your possessions, and you're just eventually going to grind out more points because of you kind of are just winning on the margins a little bit. I think that makes sense. What are some of the red flag stats that you look for a quarterback where, you look at maybe the touchdown interception ratio, completion rate, yards, those all look good. Aside from those we've talked about, that you say, all right, well, maybe there's something under the hood here that tells you some bad things are happening that haven't shown up in the basic stats yet that you think maybe some people might overlook?
Yeah, I think a lot of times there's 2 ways to kind of break down what a quarterback is doing. Is he hitting those explosive plays, or is he just keeping the chains moving? That's kind of the EPA per play does include the explosive plays, and then success rate, whether a player is successful. And the best way to explain that is you start off on 1st and 10. If you get about 4 to 5 yards on first down, that's probably going to be a successful play. If you get 2 to 3 yards and make it into a 3rd and manageable, we'll consider that a successful play. And on 3rd and 4th down, if you convert, we'll consider that we'll consider that a successful play. That's basically what EPA is doing itself. given those considerations about down and distance. But if you are able to accomplish that time over time, that's really a signifier that you can be a consistent quarterback. And so an offense, for example, that was led by Patrick Mahomes last year, we were able to get a sense that even though it looked like Patrick Mahomes was having a down year, that they were actually being very consistent at keeping the downs moving. And that was a green flag that he was probably good old Patrick Mahomes, just maybe didn't have the weapons or the offensive line. So when you flip that back to the other side, a red flag would be if a player is hitting a lot of explosive plays, sure, that's great, but then the success rate is not there. And a great example of this is Sam Darnold last year. Through the first couple of games where the Vikings looked like a true revelation, and obviously they went on to win a ton of games and make the playoffs, we had a sense that maybe something had really changed, except that success rate was not there. He was really nailing big variant plays. Obviously, you get Justin Jefferson and some of those really talented guys down the way, but it ended up kind of spiraling off at the end of the year. Why was that? He wasn't able to keep the chains moving. And I think that was a massive, massive part of why the Minnesota Vikings decided to go ahead and let him go and not pay him the big bucks and go with J.J. McCarthy, even though it was a little bit of a shakeup, is because they just didn't see that level of play-by-play, moving the chains, staying ahead of the negative plays that they did, that they expected to with Sam Darnold going into this year. And I think they think J.J. McCarthy is going to be able to do a better job at that. That's a big red flag if a player is being really explosive, but the success rate is not there, particularly in the early season. That success rate typically is going to catch up with you, particularly as it is related to spreading the ball around and taking big sacks.
Is that something to keep an eye on for Russell Wilson as well, given his penchant for throwing, those deep balls down the sideline? He'll connect on a lot of those. He will take some sacks, as we've seen over the course of his career. So I imagine that's something, if Giant fans want to keep an eye on something, it's the Giants' offense's overall success rate compared to maybe some of the other specific quarterback metrics.
Yeah, that's an excellent flag. And especially if you start seeing kind of the success rate just drop, particularly given that y'all do have an excellent deep ball weapon in Malik Neighbors. And I could certainly see a true connection forging, as it kind of did with George Pickens last year, with Russ in a Pittsburgh Steelers uniform. You could see a massive EPA per play, especially if they get a couple of big wins, but as defenses start adjusting, particularly if they're not able to get the run game going, even though I did like what Tyrone Tracy did last year, that could really be a red flag, that it could be a similar trajectory as it was in a Pittsburgh Steelers uniform where that defense really struggled down the stretch.
In terms of overall offensive efficiency, Ben Baldwin puts up this a lot over the course of the year. He updates it every week. And I don't remember the exact name of the chart. You can correct me if I get it wrong. Where it's basically percentages of drives that either end in points or end in a first down conversion. He kind of has like a little bar graph. Is that a good way to kind of judge the consistency of a team in terms of, I guess that's measuring how often your drives either end in a punt or a turnover in which you're not really generating any points, right?
Yeah, I think there's this idea of drive quality, which a former colleague of ours who now works in the college space named Parker Fleming also thought about a lot. And basically it's like, how can I get an at-bat? Football is a game where you don't necessarily control as an offense where you are getting the ball. You have to rely on the defense and the special teams to do that. That's why it's a true complementary team game. But once you get inside, your own 40, that's an at-bat. And you've got to be able to take advantage of that. So for folks that like baseball, think of those rates of quality drive metrics or ability to convert a first down or ability to score a touchdown or get a field goal as an at-bat. And you want to have as high of a conversion percentage of that as possible. Because even though your defense may not be good, or even though, your special teams may struggle at any given point in time, you may have your punter hurt, your kicker hurt, anything like that. If your offense is really converting, much like the Kansas City Chiefs, as I talked about a little bit earlier, that's probably a good sign that you're going to be successful and at least be competitive in a lot of these games.
And folks, just so you understand too, Sam was a linebacker, Tulane. He played, so he's not just some guy in a room with a calculator. Just so you understand where he's coming from here. And it's funny you bring that up. Because when you look at, that type of drive quality stats, you realize how limited your opportunities are in a football game. And, two big metrics that I know coaches are obsessed with, and understandably so, because they do lead to winning and losing, is third down success and red zone success.
Right.
The problem is that those two very important metrics can be very volatile. So
Yeah.
can you talk about from a math perspective and how you analyze the game, how those two metrics can, in one way, be vitally important to winning or losing, but also in another way, be very difficult to control from game to game as a team?
Yeah, and you bring it up. Football is a small sample size sport. You get a limited chance to knock it out of the ballpark here. And, like you said, as a former linebacker, as someone who had to play both against the run and the pass, you really get a sense of how limited those chances are, because you probably are going to have to cover a slot receiver 5-6 times a game. That's a small number, but those 5-6 times a game are probably going to make a big difference, because that's a matchup that the offense wants to take advantage of. So moving a little bit further into those third down and red zone attempts, yes, you have very few of them. And yes, you want to be really good at them. But the kind of key there is how long are those third downs? Like, that's kind of the hidden kind of mix there. Obviously, once you get in the red zone, it's 20 yards. Maybe, you can cut that down a little bit and you want to get as close to the goal line as possible. But in particular, when it comes to clutch offense or third down offense or conversion offenses, it's really how you're doing on first and second down. And much unfortunately, there's no better example than NFC East rival Philadelphia Eagles. Sure, they have a great clutch offense. You know why? Because they get in third and fourth and 1 every single time and just push on to get it past. That performance on first and second down is why they are such a good conversion offense. And that's typically what teams have kind of switched to being now in the last 3-4 years, is instead of looking at quarterbacks or looking at personnel, offensive linemen that are great clutch players, I want a team that can get me in third and short every time, because the numbers say that I can probably convert that with a quarterback sneak, with a halfback dive, with a little fullback push or something like that, rather than having an old school style quarterback who can consistently get me out of 3rd and 5 and 3rd and 7s.
Huddle up, get in here. If you're lined up here, you gotta go over the middle with it to score.
Right. How do we make that happen?
I don't know.
But Citizens does.
Make sense of your money with Citizens, official bank of Eli Manning.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. All right, let's talk a little about offensive line play, Sam. You talk about pressure rates that can be wonky. There was a game last year where, I got a call on Monday from somebody that, they had to Kayvon Thibodeau for 0 pressures. Then you look at the box score, he had 3 quarterback hits in the game, right? So it just shows you how, depending if it's like PFF, which is someone doing it manually by hand, or next gen stats, where it's, I think, distance, right, from the dot to the dot in terms of how far they are away, that's going to register a pressure. And then you have time to pressure too, right? Where if an offensive line allows a pressure, but the pressure happens at 3.7 seconds, that's probably not the offensive line's fault. So how do you go about really judging overall offensive line play in both the pass and the run game, understanding there are so many variables in some of these bigger statistics that we might use?
So to kind of set the level here, offensive line is a strange wizardry. And I think if you talk about those great offensive line coaches, we have Bob Wiley of Hard Knocks fame, said Hutt.
And by the way, I should also mention you have ESPN's pass block win rate and, run block win rate. Like, how did you figure that out? Anyway, go ahead.
Right. It's very difficult to kind of uncouple that wizardry, because number one, the offensive line is the first person who makes a move on any part of the ball. Jim Harbaugh has a great quote in that, I want to invest in offensive linemen because no one can help them, much less has to help them. And that's really the key. And moreover, they are all working together in a common goal. If you're a wide receiver, you have a route, you have an assignment, you're trying to do that. Only does the offensive line have to consider what the guard is doing if I'm a tackle, or what the center is doing if I'm a guard. So it's a little different. There's some wizardry. It's very, very hard to keep track of. But at Sumer Sports, we figured out a pretty good storytelling element of the first 2 seconds. How big of a probability is it that quarterback is going to get dropped? The second 2 seconds. So basically, once he's hit his drop back, how important is what's going on there? What does that mean? And then finally, we kind of chalk the past 4 seconds up to the quarterback, like you said. Here's where we found some really interesting insights. The Cincinnati Bengals give up a lot of sacks, But they also have two awesome wide receivers and a pretty good left tackle. Their left tackle typically does very well when it comes to, the first 2 seconds, the middle 2 seconds, and then after that, he struggles a little bit. All the rest of the line really struggles. And so what that tells us is that, okay, outside of the left tackle position, the offensive line isn't that great, but also Joe Burrow likes to hold the ball. You have to analyze if that's a problem or not, given your offensive line. And we find that it's not really that big of a problem because Jamar Chase and T. Higgins are excellent at route running and they're excellent after the catch. And so you kind of add it all together and their offensive line is probably doing what it needs to do. They're just kind of trying to get as much juice out of every single play. And sometimes that leads to a little bit more sacks, but it's been very profitable for them given the talent of Joe Burrow and the wide receivers. Other teams could not even remotely do that. And so that's kind of the story that we try to tell. It's very descriptive. Will it tell us how teams are doing in the future? Maybe not necessarily, but it helps us kind of peel that onion of offensive line play. And especially when the run game is such a small distribution, you typically on any given run play, you're not going to get the most explosive play as compared to the pass game. That's really what we want to hone into is how the offensive line is doing in the first couple of seconds, in the middle couple of seconds, and then if they're able to maintain through the quarterback scrambling or the quarterback holding the ball or the quarterback throwing the ball away. That's kind of the story that we try to look at. And we look at that mostly with tracking data. It's very difficult to do on a play-by-play, old school box score basis.
Okay, now let's go to the run game part of it, right? Mm-hmm. How do you separate offensive line run blocking with running back success and vice versa?
So it's very difficult, mostly because it's extremely hard to predict running back success in any given year. The running back position is by far the hardest to predict. And that's the reason why it's the lowest paid in the NFL, because you never know who is going to be great in any given year. Saquon Barkley, for example, I think it was a totally informed, logical decision to let him go, but he gets behind an awesome offensive line. All of a sudden, prior to contact, he's doing very well. So ironically, what we see is performance after contact tells us a little bit about the running backs' contribution versus the offensive line's contribution. That's typically what we like to see before or after contact. How are these players doing? It's not the best by any means because the run game, just when it comes down to it, is not as efficient as the passing game. And I know a lot of people like to talk about hard-nosed football, old school football, setting the tone, being physical. And as a former linebacker, I know for a fact that's true. It sucks when you're getting pounded for 2-3 yards over and over again. I played in a conference with Army and Navy. I absolutely hated it going against the triple option where they're just gaining 3 and 4 yards and keeping it chugging along. And it's tough to do, but the reality of the situation, and if you've ever attended a training camp practice or an all-star game practice that is not full contact, you can see this. The running game is muddled up. When those guys are not hitting the ground, you never know if it's a good run or a bad run. And the reason is because that's really how it is even when you are full-scale hitting. It's difficult to tell or predict when a player is going to pop a big run. And as a result, the passing game is just substantially more efficient. And as a result, it's just very difficult to, figure out what the real difference maker is between your offensive line and running back. I personally believe that it's a little easier to tell if an offensive line is doing good just because you can sense when that running back is actually getting hit in terms of yardage. So I would prefer to invest in the offensive line rather than the running back position. And the stats kind of bear that out a little bit as well.
Are you a believer in the tackles broken per carry stats? Because I feel like a lot of times those can be a little wonky too, the same way, some of the pressure stats can be a little wonky.
When you deep dive into the data, it's not, it's tough. It's tough to say. Obviously, it's a great stat to show what a player has done in a year, but it's not going to tell you what he's going to do the next year. And so I don't put a ton of thought into those statistics of broken tackles per carry, or we have a statistic that we calculate at Sumer Sports, which is like tackle probability or the end of the play probability negated over the course of a play. while it is great to describe what happened on a play and describe whether a running back deserves credit for that play, it's just very difficult to discuss if a Najee Harris, who is now going to the Chargers, is going to do the same thing that he did in a Steelers uniform.
You've mentioned predictive stats a couple times, which is kind of the whole trick, right? If you're trying to find a quality value free agent, you try to pinpoint a couple of numbers where you're like, all right, well, maybe this will end up translating. And even when you're drafting players, right? What translates from college to the pros? For quarterbacks, I know Warren Sharp is a big proponent of looking at numbers on early downs from a clean pocket, and that is something that is consistent from year to year for players a lot of the time. What are some of those predictive stats for quarterbacks when you're trying to figure out, all right, this is something that's steady from year to year?
So typically when we're looking at quarterbacks, you can divide it all up. And the problem is when you divide it all up, you want to make sure you get that big sample. Right. And so when you have, first down or third down or when pressured, clean pocket, you're just limiting your sample size. It's a little hard to get erroneous. There's a couple of things that we really like to look at. Number one, like you mentioned, on a drop back, what that player actually wants to do with that drop back is immensely predictive. And so a player who scrambles a lot, he's going to continue scrambling a lot. We very rarely see a player not continue to scramble a lot unless there's a massive, massive change in his physical composition. Dak Prescott comes to mind, for example. When he was back at Mississippi State, he was more of a mobile guy, turned into more of a pocket passer with the Dallas Cowboys. But that's typically what I really like to understand is when that player is dropping back, are they scrambling? Are they throwing the ball away, which is very key as compared to trying, like Joe Burrow, like I discussed, to stay in there and make a play. And then obviously the step up from that is their efficiency or success rate on those different types of plays. That's pretty predictive. It's not the most predictive thing of all time, but that's typically like how I want to get a sense of a quarterback and how they will do in the future is I know they're going to probably continue no matter the coach, no matter the offensive line, no matter the team. They're probably going to continue being themselves in what they decide to do, whether they decide to throw the ball, whether they decide to throw it away, whether they're allowing themselves to be pressured a lot, whether they're scrambling outside of the pocket. That's pretty sticky. That's pretty predictive. It'll tell us what that player is doing. And then if they're doing any of those core things well, I, as a coach or as a former player, would definitely encourage them to continue doing that.
All right, let's jump to wide receiver. Yards per route run. That's, I think, a pretty good universal number. Are you on board with that in terms of an overall way to look at a wide receiver's efficiency and any other numbers that you think for wide receivers are very important?
So wide receivers are the most predictive position on the football field by far. And I'll include tight ends in this as well, even though there's obviously that blocking element, which we can't quantify super well, but pass catchers are immensely sticky. And I think this is the reason why, because it shows up in the numbers. Target share is one of my favorite statistics when it comes to fantasy, when it comes to adding players, when it comes to even adding collegiate players. Target share is the amount of targets as compared to the total team targets when a player is active in a game. Some of the leaders in target share, Malik Neighbors last year, was a guy who is just a target earner. Puka Nacua. And typically these guys who are some of the best in the league are excellent target earners, and that shows up in target share. That sticks. Basically, if they are going to continue to play a lot of snaps, they are going to earn a similar level of targets. So great outlook from Malik Neighbors there for this year. And I think despite the quarterback change, he is going to continue to have a near 30% target share, which is amongst the highest in the league. That's my expectation for this year because of that statistic. You couple it with what you just said, John, yards per route run, which is an efficiency metric. And if you can have a high target share and an excellent yards per route run, you are an elite receiver in this league, and you will continue as long as injuries are not inhibiting how much you are playing. An interesting test case of this, though, Marvin Mims, the kind of gadget back wide receiver slot guy for the Denver Broncos, played a lot of snaps, had an immensely high yards per route run, but didn't have that level of target share. That indicates to me that Sean Payton views him as a gadget guy. He views him as a guy who can only win in certain situations, screens and deep balls. And thus, if he starts to earn more target share as he continues throughout his career, he'll be an elite receiver. But you kind of got to have both, because both are very sticky and both really indicate how good a wide receiver is.
If you want to know how to manage 2 minutes of crunch time football, I'm your man. But if you're wondering about a long-term financial plan, you should talk to Citizens. Hey, I can also talk lawn care.
I'd like to learn about a mowing routine.
Yes, I knew I could help. Make sense of your money with Citizens.
Okay, let's jump over to defense. But first, I want to remind people that the Giants Huddle podcast is brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. From game day celebrations to your everyday financial needs, Big Blue fans can get the most out of every moment with Citizens. Learn more at citizensbank.com/Giants. And we're coming to you from the Hackensack Meridian Health Podcast Studio. Keep getting better. Joined by Sam Bruchhaus from Sumer Sports. And you can find all those stats, by the way, at sumersports.com. I have it up in front of me. They're all listed. They're sortable. It's really, really handy. Go check that out. Defense, Sam, and then I want to get into some of the technology stuff with you and some AI stuff. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that are emerging about defense, which, again, I think it's much more difficult to quantify because it's such an 11-person operation where it's hard to kind of, single anything out. But when you think about defense as a former defender yourself, what are some of the key metrics that you want to look at from a team and individual perspective?
So the reason why we have found that defensive tackles and defensive ends have become a premium position is because, very similar to wide receivers, they're just lower, very, very predictive in the rates at which they pressure the quarterback, at the rates at which they run stuff. We can pretty well quantify how good front level players are going to be, defensive tackles and defensive ends. A great example of this is a player like Trey Hendrickson, who had a defensive player of the year level year last year in terms of the sacks, but his pressures have remained pretty much the same year after year after year, even going back to his time in New Orleans. And that's typically going to be the case, specifically for defensive tackles, given that defensive tackles do have slightly specialized roles as compared to defensive ends who may be dropping back, or often outside linebackers who may be dropping back.
Sure.
Speaking of linebackers, though, linebackers and safeties are virtually impossible to predict how they're going to play. And I think that's why you see players like Zach Bond move from the New Orleans Saints to the Eagles and all of a sudden become an all-pro player. And I think that's why it's very hard to say who some of the elite linebackers are in this league outside of a guy like Fred Warner, a Bobby Okereke, some of those guys who have been well thought about for multiple years, because you have to play both the pass and the run every single play. You never know what's going to happen. You're relying on the offensive line and the tight ends and the halfbacks to give you your keys. And it's very difficult to quantify what they're even trying to do at any given point in time, unless you are in that clubhouse.
And Sam, it's funny. It's funny. You mentioned it with the running backs. Same thing with safeties and linebackers. You go watch an all-star game practice, you have no idea who the good linebackers and safeties are after you walk out of one of those practices.
Exactly. 100%. It's very, very difficult to tell. And I think that's why, as a kind of football watching society, we lean towards these playmakers so much. And in reality, sometimes you get guys that just do their job and chug along, and those end up being some really excellent players, some really core pieces on defenses, despite players who, in particular, safeties who make a ton of plays, being particularly a little volatile when it comes to busting, but maybe getting a pick here or there.
And then corners, I know PFF has tried to figure out their coverage grades. It's something that I know they've struggled trying to figure out, because, a lot of times the guys with the best grades are the guys that get targeted a lot. And a lot of times guys get targeted a lot because they're letting guys get open. And it's hard to credit somebody for covering their guy and the quarterback doesn't throw in their direction. So where are we at in terms of trying to figure out some type of metric for determining good corner play?
Yeah, basically the only thing that even remotely tracks year over year is exactly what you said, targets per snap. And so guys who are targeted, it's nowhere near on the other side of the ball where target share is so big. But typically, when guys have targets on their back on the defensive side and the offense sees red, they're going to go after them. And that's going to be the game plan. The problem is that cornerback is really the only immensely small sample position on the field where, a wide receiver, the quarterback's making the decision to target them, to where a cornerback, a guy like Pat Surtain, may get targeted like 2 or 3 times a game for a 16, 17 game season. Now, that's an indication of how good he is, but at the same time, maybe they're attacking via the run game. Maybe they're attacking via the screen game. And because of that small sample, it's deeply, deeply difficult to predict year over year how these players are going to do. I think this is probably one where the eye does do kind of a better job than necessarily the box score statistics when it comes to interceptions or things like that.
All right. 2 things. Give me reality checks on these 2 things, then we'll head on to the technology portion of this. Is there such thing as a defense that's good at takeaways, or is it so dependent on the offense making mistakes that's impossible to even think about correlating from year to year?
Correlating year to year as a data scientist, and this is where my mind starts splitting, I think it's very, very difficult to be a team year over year that just causes turnovers. However, my former player brain says you create your own luck. And so there are teams that, really focus on punching the ball out. They practice it as a skill. And so when you put your positions, when you put your players in those positions, then yeah, you probably are going to have more chances if you take those chances. Will those chances end up being turnovers? Maybe not. So I think something that I'd love to chart moving forward would be those opportunities, those punches on the balls, those pass breakups, those abilities when it's just close enough, but you're exercising great technique as a former linebacker. But at the same time, there's a lot of variables that have to go into that. The offense has to be compliant, and they really don't want to be compliant when it comes to turning the ball over. So I think it's very difficult. I'd reality check you on that one.
Okay. Number 2, is there such thing as a pass rusher that's a better finisher than another pass rusher? Or is it a product of what's going on behind him, his other teammates on the defensive line not giving the quarterback escape routes, just the way the whole defense is configured? Or are there some pass rushers that, look, this guy just gets sacks, it's not just pressures?
Now, that is an excellent question. I think on paper, there is such thing as great finishers. There's guys that just year over year have an excellent conversion rate. Now, that's very limited to the tippy top of the scale. And I think given schedule, given division, that could change in any given point of year, particularly because you think of guys like Tom Brady, like Drew Brees, they're getting the ball out quick. And the reason they're getting the ball out quick is because they don't want to get hit by the Cam Jordans of the world, or they don't want to get hit by the Shaq Barretts of the world sticking in that NFC South from years ago. So there are external elements. I do think that, tackling is a skill that you want to work on, particularly as it comes. But on paper, it's very difficult to see, a guy like Jared Verse, for example, last year, who was excellent. He provided a lot of pressure. He did a really good job. Didn't show up in the sack column. I could definitely see him having a 10-plus sack year this year.
All right. And then you just brought something up, so I got to ask you one other question. One thing that frustrates me when people just look at numbers, and football is such a matchup-based league. A lot of times, I don't think people take opponents into consideration when they look at, smaller sample sizes of stats during a season. I'm going to use Russell Wilson as an example of this. They're like, yeah, he was doing great. The Steelers are doing great, but man, teams figured it out and they just collapsed at the end of the year. And then I say, I'm not sure. It could just be the fact that they played at Philly, at Baltimore, home versus Kansas City, and home versus the Bengals to close the year. And maybe that has more to do with it than something else. Is that something that you try to stress with people, that in the NFL, the quality of the opponent and who you're playing has such an outward impact on effectiveness of any player or even unit in a game that you have to take that into consideration, especially when you're looking at smaller sample sizes?
I think you do to a certain degree. And you mentioned the Steelers. I was thinking about the Ravens last year. Get off to a slow start, but Lamar Jackson had an excellent EPA per play. They were one of the best run-stuffing defenses in the league. When you have those key indicators, despite having a really hard schedule, probably indicates you're going to be a good team. Those are those things that you want to look at early season.
Makes sense. All right. Let's go to technology really quick. You guys doing some awesome stuff at Sumer, and we're going to have more conversations about this. We're going to have Sam Schwartzstein from Amazon, who does their, special broadcast, their vision broadcast. We're going to talk more about that later in the month. But I know you guys are doing great stuff over at Sumer, using AI to help football teams, coaches, and GMs do their jobs. Talk about how that has kind of broken through in the NFL and how you guys are using it to not only help GMs build rosters the best way,
Right.
but also now helping coaches game plan.
Oh, 100%. So I think you got to like compare it to what coaches used to do, because I think it's a misnomer that football is not an analytical game, because coaches have been doing the analytics by themselves, maybe not at the scale we have, for years and years and years. And that informs a lot of what we do.
But Bill Belichick was doing it for the Giants in the 80s. The
100%. 100%. I got his dad's book over here about scouting, and a lot of the stuff that he was doing was very analytically based. The issue in football is always going to be sample and scale. And what we do at Sumer Sports is all about increasing sample and doing it at scale. And so we have an excellent artificial intelligence team who is able to make readings on every single millisecond of a play, every single millisecond, and compare it to every single millisecond from the past, going back years and years and years. What that allows us to do is, rather than just the results of the play, which we've discussed today has so many variables, it allows us to get a sense of the important geometries of football, the important connections between the quarterback, the wide receiver, and the offensive lineman. And as a result, it allows us to predict basically at any point in the play who may be targeted, where the quarterback may go, if he's going to make a first read throw, and many, many, many other things, including just sheer results like sacks and tackles.
And also what the ideal decision should be on that play, right?
Exactly. Because, as you said, when you can compare the result on a millisecond by millisecond basis, you can identify when the best time to throw the ball was, who the best person to throw the ball was. And when you have those key insights at scale and over a large sample, it allows for better decision-making. And more importantly, it allows for better coaching. And that's kind of the place that I think we're going that other people aren't necessarily going. I think in football, there's a lot of, I just want to know who the best players are. Well, this is a developmental game. You got to develop those players. And when you can go to the film and break down the individual moments at which these key events are occurring, and at which, you may not see something, but in the history of football, it's been hit time and time again by the greats. That's a key element that is key for coaching, key for development. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is join kind of that old school approach of watching film and learning by watching the game with technology that allows us to do that at a much bigger scale and allows us to remember many, many, many more things.
And I got to imagine that the NFL is such a copycat league. Everyone uses the same plays, right? Like there are very few new plays in the National Football League. You guys can probably figure out like, all right, this play works consistently. This is a good play, especially against this specific coverage, right?
Right.
This play may be not effective. Well, you know what? On this play, you put this motion into this play. Well, it's going to make it better. You take motion out of this play. Maybe that makes that play better. Are you able to break it down to that level of granularity?
Yeah, that brings up an excellent point. And I don't want to be biased. I know I'm an old linebacker over here, but it's so hard to figure out run versus pass. Obviously, as you mentioned, like once you get those keys, it's going to be inside zone or outside zone. There's only so many plays that can be ran. But the key is understanding run versus pass, especially in a league which has moved substantially towards early down play action. And that's why we've seen some of these offenses, Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, Mike McDaniel, some of these other guys be immensely effective as offensive coordinating head coaches because they understand the dynamics of the game. We're able to get a reading immediately on run pass. And ironically, some of them are quite surprising plays that, with the eye just given on that single play, you may not have been able to identify why it's a pass. But then when you go into the data, you start noticing the splits are different. You start noticing the tight end is aligning a little differently. The wide receiver is moving a little differently. And it's that way across, teams and plays and systems. And then you can kind of start to identify what those early point keys are when you start mixing in the film with the identification of, well, this actually, despite looking like a heavy run on 3rd and 4, it actually is probably going to be a pass here.
And if you give that to your middle linebacker, he sees something with an early motion or where the tight end's aligned. Is he another half yard off the tackle? Where is he lined up? then he can call some type of adjustment, and that could give the defense a huge advantage.
100%. And it's all about scale here. Again, the Luke Kuechly's of the world, the Demario Davises of the world, they'll identify this, but they're going to have to watch 5 days of film. If we can get it to them on day one,
right,
that allows them to uncover all kinds of gems about technique or about, how the player is dropping back, which we can't necessarily do because right now it's basically just dots on a chessboard in terms of what we can actually track accurately. We're working towards getting joint tracking and things like that allow us to do a lot more. But just think of all the possibilities if you can get that insight to them on day one of how much they can uncover using their excellent football brains.
I want to flip this back to the offense. I would imagine now in a league where teams are doing a lot of post-snap coverage adjustments, trying to disguise, are you able to do the same thing for an offense where based on defensive player movement, you can predict what type of coverage they're going to be in?
Yeah, and that kind of comes into those geometries, and that's something that we weren't able to do without tracking data. When we're just looking at play-by-play box score, or even someone just denoting cover 3 or cover 4 or something like that, doesn't really tell us a whole bunch. But when we have millisecond by millisecond, foot by foot tracking of the players, the models start noticing patterns. And really it's literally called pattern matching when we're talking about these things like wizard palms and all these different types of schemes. And so when you can pattern matching, it allows us to get a better sense of what to look at, especially when it comes from the quarterback position, the center position, and the running back position. Those 3 key positions where you're trying to identify the tough parts of the defense.
That's interesting. And I imagine this is stuff that I can't imagine the NFL will never allow this on game days, right? Where you can get this data on game days, have the coordinators have it upstairs, communicate it. The NFL doesn't allow video, right, on the sidelines. I doubt they'll allow anything like this. This is more get it to them on Monday, getting ready for the game type of stuff rather than game day stuff, correct?
Precisely. I could foresee how the game could change. Right now, the technology probably is not to the speed, the streaming speed, where it could probably support that. Obviously, that's coming. We see the great improvements in how fast AI is, even as it pertains to like ChatGPT, for example, and how fast, GPUs and computers can really compute things and stream things. It's not quite there yet, but really the basis of analytics, which was, fundamentalized by John Berger, who used to be at the New York Giants, was the rule book itself. And it's going to be similarly governed moving forward. The rule book itself is going to allow or not allow great innovations on a play-by-play basis as compared to a prep basis.
All right, that's on-field stuff. Anything else from a tech perspective for coaches and players that you think we should hit on before we talk about team building real quick?
Well, I think it's just fascinating, particularly how the consumer artificial intelligence, AI and stuff like that, is going to end up applying at some point to the things that we're working on with great models. We have what they call multimodal models. The idea of that is you type in something in natural language and it can sort through photos and videos. I can imagine coaches just getting that in their hands and absolutely loving it. And that's what we're working on right now. We have Sumer Brain, which will be betaing during the season. And I can't wait to see the great insights that we can reap from some of that stuff.
So basically a coach could say, all right, show me all the video of a team starting in a 2-safety shell, but playing, man-to-man with a robber, and show me all those plays. Let's say they could do something like that.
That's what we're moving towards, John.
Wow. That's crazy. That's really cool. All right, finally, I know this is kind of touching back on some of the overall stats we talked about. Team building. How do you guys help assist teams in terms of utilizing cap space, trying to, again, predict what players to attack in free agency, what players to draft, and how is that kind of moving along?
Yeah, it's so interesting, John, particularly as, we're in the preseason. We all want the games. Everyone's putting out lists of who we think is good and who we think is not good. And I think particularly as it deals with some of these extensions of players holding out, when you look at the numbers versus what it seems like they want, there is typically going to be a true difference between these guys who have held out into the into the training camp season because, frankly, the numbers just aren't there. Now, are there other things to consider? Team chemistry, leadership, the ability to fill a role, the things that the offense coordinator is asking them to do. Yes, our goal is to provide those key metrics that identify predictively how that player is going to do and directly tie that into their compensation. So you look at a guy like Terry McLaurin, who's holding out right now. It seems like he wants to be paid at a rate of one of the highest paid wide receivers in the league. His numbers just really don't support that right now. He's not necessarily a top 5 to 10 guy, hasn't been in his career in some of those target share, yards per route run, etc. metrics. Obviously, he has the All-Pro. Obviously, he's on ESPN's top 10 list. But I think that's why there's such kind of a mismatch between what the Commanders want to pay him and what Terry McLaurin wants to be paid. Because when you get that All-Pro designation, obviously that means you're one of the top 4 wide receivers in the National Football League. But when the metrics don't necessarily back it up, may indicate that it's more on Jaden Daniels or more on Cliff Kingsbury. And I think that's why we try to provide the best metrics, both to agents to try to get their guys paid and also to teams to make sure that they're managing that cap properly.
Sam, this has been awesome. Tell the folks everything you're doing at Sumer. I know a lot of the stuff is, behind closed doors with teams that you do, but I know you're doing more public facing stuff, podcast, the website. Tell everybody everything they need to know about what Sumer's up to.
Yeah. So if you loved this discussion, you will love our website during the season. And I know I use it every single day. So check out sumersports.com, particularly as you're moving into the fantasy season. If you play fantasy football, you can find those target share, yards per route runs, all very, very good, hefty fantasy stats to latch onto for next year. I'm very big on Puka Nacua this year as a result in my fantasy leagues. So go give those a look. And then we're coming back in maybe, I think the 28th is the official day, the Sumer Sports Show. Me and Lindsey Rhodes will be breaking down all kinds of insights like this, giving some hot takes about the season. And then, John, I'm ready for these games, baby. I have week 0 on the college football season. There's a game in Ireland that I just have circled because I just need some football. I'm super excited.
Well, dude, what are we getting? Texas, Ohio State in August this year?
Oh, man. Week 1 in college football, Texas, Ohio State, Clemson, LSU. I don't think it gets better than that. We come back to next week with some classic NFL football. Really seems like every team has some hope this year, which is exciting. That's not always the case. We have some teams with new quarterbacks like the New York Giants, Tennessee Titans. So it's just going to be a blast. I can't wait for the 2025 season.
Sam, always great talking to you, my friend. Appreciate the time.
Thank you very much.
That's the Giants Huddle podcast brought to you by Citizens, the official bank of the Giants. From the Hackensack Marine Health Podcast studio, keep getting better. I'm John Schmeelk. For Sam, we'll see you next time, everybody.